Hello and welcome to the 3D Blu-ray Bunker. This is where I look exclusively at films on 3D Blu-ray, not to do a movie review but to focus almost entirely on the 3D, with just a short word at the end about the film itself. And this time I'm looking at Dark Country from 2009. It's got an aspect ratio of 1.85 to 1 and it was shot in native 3D. This is one of only a tiny handful of 3D films from the modern era that was released prior to Avatar, so maybe whilst the modern 3D boom has been directly attributed to Cameron's Juggernaut, I like to think that Dark Country's director and star Thomas Jane can cheekily claim responsibility for making Avatar such a huge 3D hit in the first place. This, though, is right at the opposite end of the budget scale and possibly had a shorter production period than the time it took to cut together the Avatar trailer. So this is a low-budget, horror-inflected noir thriller, and unlike many of the mega-budget post-conversions, this is a film that doesn't just welcome the use of 3D, but it really embraces it and squeezes it hard. There's potent and strong 3D on show pretty much the whole way through the film. Right from the start, you're struck by the amount of depth there is in this bed. It's a view that is in no way being timid with the lens separation, stretching the room deeper than the natural human view would be, and creating a sense of space that I think heightens the ominous atmosphere that you can feel as soon as the film begins. This really is full-bodied 3D that reveals and shows off not just the shape but the form of its stars, and here you can feel the structure of her face and curves of her body far more intimately than a 2D view could dream of offering. I like this shot of her on the bed, not so much because of the almost comical movie positioning of the bedsheet, but also because the strength of the 3D makes the bed feel significantly higher off the ground than it actually is. It gives it an almost fairy tale air of floating, although as things progress this film is definitely not in happy fairy tale land. So the two stars' faces are absolutely sculpted into solid 3D space, and in close-up during a moment of automotive eroticism, their faces are thrown into what feels like about as strong a three-dimensional shape as they could get away with, and it really gives them both a presence in the scene that enhances the feel of what's going on. It's not all perfect though, and this scene also throws up one of the issues with the film, and that's a handful of 2D shots which for the most part don't seem to serve any purpose being in 2D, and that makes me assume that they were maybe down to technical issues with the camera rig. I'm only guessing, but it could be that if there had been problems on a take and they reshot, possibly they went with the better take from a performance point of view. Like here, this is a scene that began with this shot in 3D, then it cut to him, and then back to her when it's suddenly in 2D. I can't see any good artistic reason for that, so my assumption is that it's from a different take of the same scene, where in one take one of the cameras was playing up, but like I say, I don't know. There are other 2D moments that I imagine weren't shown in 3D because of there being far too much disparity between the left and right eye views, like the lens flare here, although there are moments with that exact problem that are kept in 3D and they look pretty awkward as a result of it. There's also lens flare that looks excellent in 3D, something that always surprises and amazes me in natively shot 3D that it can work so well. I thought the weirdest 2D moment was this one. So the couple and everything in the car are in 2D, but the view out of the rear window is clearly set in 3D space behind them. I don't know if that was a case of making the most of an accidental 2D shot, or I think more probably it was part of the extreme stylization that really is at the heart of the movie. It also adds to the feel of it being a bit like a panel from a graphic novel, and I know Thomas Jane used some well-known comic book guys, Timothy Bradstreet and Bernie Wrightson, to do design work on the film, and also the film is dedicated to the memory of Dave Stevens, who I assume is the same Dave Stevens as the author of what was turned into my all-time favourite comic book adaptation, The Rocketeer. What this shot also clearly shows off, in its extreme style, is the absolute obviousness of its composite shots. It would be easy to write this off as being a result of the film's low budget, but I'm sure this was very much an intentional look. It's really reminiscent of that long-gone rear projection look that I think I most associate with Hitchcock, and Quentin Tarantino definitely made it obvious on purpose in Pulp Fiction, which I'm sure is what they're doing here. Another one of the film's 3D problems is in reflection conflicts, where the left and right eye view capture different amounts of reflection off objects, and I think this is often most noticeable around areas of those composite lines. And there are other composite shots in the film like this this one, where using the technique allows them to get very strong 3D in his face, but at the same time keeping the background looking okay, which I think makes this a very smart use of 3D, the powerful depth in his face here being at another one of the film's very dramatic moments. A large portion of the film is set in a car, this big old Dodge, which the 3D manages to make look even longer than it would in real life. And there's lots of buttons and knobs in this thing, which all occupy nicely exaggerated 3D space. It's all atmospheric, and it even seems to make it that bit more unnerving watching him select drive here. At least that looks like what he's doing, but I've never seen a gear selector before that looks more like the buttons on a car radio. But maybe that was a 1960s Detroit thing. There's also the car that I've been more aware of across 3D cinema than any other, that American classic, the Mustang Ford. And like the Dodge, it's thrown into excellent and strong 3D space. So with a lot of the film being set in a car, the view of the road ahead is also fantastic in 3D as it stretches away deep into the screen, helping to convey the feeling of wondering where this road is going to take us, and heightening the notion that it might be somewhere dark and mysterious. The film also uses some fairly classic three-dimensional views very well, like being caged in here, and again it feels like a measured and perfect use of the exact right amount of lens separation to make the shot strongly effective, but without going too far and losing the illusion, which I think can be a pretty difficult balance, but it's something they do so well throughout the film. A staircase is another structure that looks at its best in 3D, with this one looking especially good with all of those moody shadows across 3D space. There's a view that whenever it's done well in a post-converted 3D film, it always impresses me, and that's someone behind a dirty screen or mirror, and it's something that native 3D just does naturally with ease, and this is a moment in the film where the 3D maybe helps us to appreciate that perhaps we're through the looking glass at this point. There's a bit where something has to be buried, and instead of doing the obvious thing for a low-budget 3D film and shoving a shovel in our face, this is way more sophisticated, and instead we get a great three-dimensional view of Lauren German being shrouded in the shoveled dirt, which may or may not be a fantastic piece of 3D foreshadowing. And the 3D is extremely atmospheric in the way it presents the view looking back up at them after they've done their burying. So I really love the native 3D in this film, but there's also some views that aren't the product of using a 3D camera rig, as we get this shot of the starry sky above the road, and one of the stars has been placed into the foreground. This is really interesting, and I assume it's like a guiding star in religion. This is just before they have their roadside encounter with destiny, on the right-hand side of the road, which is where this lone star is placed out into the foreground. And they do a lot more with stars in 3D space too. These are shots that would be totally impossible to photograph, even with one camera on the west coast and one on the east. The star field is spread deep across the z-axis, and this for me did a couple of things, one of which was to make him feel swept up in some sort of cosmic weirdness, engulfed by some great power, and also invoked the opening titles of The Twilight Zone, which is somewhere the events of this film feel like they belong. There's something else going on with star fields here, which I might be reading too much into, but I don't think so. One of the effects of putting the stars into strong 3D space in several views of them is that it concentrates your attention on them, so you maybe find yourself paying a bit more attention to them than you otherwise might, even when they're in their more normal 2D view like here, and in doing this you soon start to notice a bit of wallpaper effect. Now again, it could be a result of the film's low budget, but I just don't think that generating a random star field is going to be all that difficult or costly, so I think what's going on here is maybe a very subtle and clever comment about repeating patterns, something which is obviously inherent to the film's story. I love the bloody handprint on the windscreen here, which could easily be overlooked in 2D, but when seen in 3D space it immediately grabs your attention. And there are some flies buzzing around a lamp, making for another lovely moody 3D shot, with their death symbolism not going unnoticed as they're placed strongly into the foreground. And speaking of Hitchcock earlier, there's a shot that's reminiscent of his reaching hand in Dial M for Murder, and here it's at what turns out to be an important dramatic moment. This is a nice slow shot with time to breathe where his hand gradually emerges from the screen, and it's also a shot where the impact of his hand coming into negative space takes on a lot more meaning on a second viewing. There's a point in the film where we get a flashback to this scene. There's the usual nice and solid 3D on show here, so that's all good. And then we get a stylised transition back to the present, but something's not right about the compositing of the shot. The earlier shot's flashback is placed behind the car, but it feels like it's sitting in the wrong 3D space because, and this is obviously only visible in 3D, it's closer to us than the couple in the car. On first viewing, this just feels like an error in the compositing, and it's jarring and odd. But then, on second viewing, when you know the story, I think I realised that this shot might very well be one of the most clever and inventive uses of 3D space that I've ever seen. The flashback sitting in front of the present. It's the best example I know of where in 2D there's absolutely nothing other than a fancy transition, but in 3D it's actually brilliant and devastating. The stereographer on the film is the very experienced and excellent Max Penner, and the 3D advisor was maybe one of the most legendary names in 3D, Ray Zone. And like I said at the top, I think Thomas Jane embraced 3D with a real passion in this film, and all of that experience and planning pays massive dividends. So just a very, very quick word about the film itself, and I've maybe already given away too much about the story. For some people, I guess this would all be too easy to write off as a cheap-looking load of old nonsense, but I think there's much more to it than that. It's a couple, a nighttime drive across the Nevada desert, an encounter with a stranger, and things start to unravel. It's got a nice tight running time. I liked Thomas Jane's and Lauren German's performances. If you don't already have this, I absolutely recommend it as an excellent slice of native 3D, and I don't know if this is now out of date information, but there was a French release on 3D Blu-ray which had forced subtitles that you probably needed a high-end disc player to be able to shift off the screen, but the Turkish release didn't have that issue. In other words, as far as I'm aware, this never got a 3D Blu-ray release in its home country, which is not just a shame, but an absolute travesty. So I hope you found this in some way useful, and if so, I hope you'll join me again soon for another 3D Blu-ray review. Until then, thanks for looking in on this one, cheers for now, bye bye.